name's Scott Robinson. I'm a spokesman from the U.S. Consulate. I'm really happy to be here. I wanted to thank the university and thank Robin for helping to set this up. I think for all of us in the United States, the date, November 22nd, is a date that many, many people still remember. It's along with dates like December 7th, which for us was Pearl Harbor, and unfortunately September 11th. It's become one of those dates that people instantly recognize. And I think many people would say it was really one of the most significant events in our 20th century history. And I know Mike will give you a really good introduction to that and give you a first-hand view of what it was like, not only to be there for it or to remember it, but also to cover it as a journalist. I was a little bit young I'm a little bit young to remember the actual event, but I can tell you it's something that growing up as an American, no matter what your generation is, it's something that is really impressed upon you from a young age as being important. I'll give you an example. My father still to this day has kept the newspapers, not only from this day, but from the whole week, because the events that happened, as I'm sure Mike will explain, were really extraordinary in the days that followed. And it was really one of those times when television and the news industry was for the first time really covering an event like that. Just to tell you a little bit about Mike, he has had a long and distinguished career as a journalist. I know that HKBU, I think, did a great job in bringing him out here. He was a senior producer with NewsHour at PBS. PBS is our public broadcasting service, which is not a government entity. It's a public station. It receives some government funding, but it receives a lot of donations just from average Americans as well. And it's widely viewed as sort of the most respected of our news institutions. He's also worked for NBC, and he's also a very active blogger now. So I think he's really a good example of somebody who has covered the gamut in terms of our journalism. I hope you'll enjoy the program. I hope it will maybe deepen your understanding not only of journalism, but of American culture and history. And I really thank you all for being here, and thanks to the university for hosting Mike. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our star.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. I hope you have a chance to get around to Baptist and other universities and tell your family story to folks out here, because it will remind them why the American story and the American dream, despite everything that's happened in these last few decades, still flickers in the imagination of both Americans and people all around the world. In case I lapse into too many inside the Beltway kind of remarks or idioms, I'll be happy to do Q&A, and about anything else, happy to do Q&A at the end of my presentation. When I was leaving Washington this summer to come out here, I knew that there would be one day when it was going to be particularly difficult to be away from my country and my hometown. And that day is today, the 50th anniversary to the day, even to the day of the week, of the assassination of President Kennedy. But as the day drew closer, I knew I had to do something more than just sit around and be sad and think of things that might have been. We're journalists. We need to express ourselves. And to do that, we also need an audience. So I thank you for being the audience. It was an unseasonably warm day for late autumn in Washington in the 70s, barely jacket weather. The government city was quiet. The president and vice president and their wives were in Texas on a political trip. Half the cabinet was en route to a meeting in Japan. In the Senate, there was a routine session going on, and during routine sessions, junior senators are the presiding officer. That day, the presiding officer was the junior senator from Massachusetts, Edward M. Kennedy. But for most of Washington, their thoughts were a week ahead to the long Thanksgiving Day weekend, the most important family gathering for nearly all Americans, even more than Christmas because it is not associated with any one religion. I was a college student studying political science at George Washington University full-time and working full-time at a news bureau in the National Press Building just a couple blocks east of the White House. We had just had lunch in the office, 4 of us, with a fellow who worked on Capitol Hill, and we were talking, as is the habit frequently in Washington, about the next presidential election, about the importance of the trip to Texas by President Kennedy and his Vice President Lyndon Johnson, how Kennedy this time would really need Texas votes because he was going to be losing a lot of votes in the traditionally Democratic South because that part of the country was in basically open rebellion against President Kennedy's civil rights proposals, plans to give American black people their full legal and civil rights nearly 100 years after the Civil War and the emancipation had ended slavery. And it's hard to imagine these days what our office looked like, what our bureau looked like. And particularly, I know you guys are all connected to the world by all your electronic gizmos, your iPhones. We wrote on manual typewriters. And I've recently had great fun with my contemporaries on Facebook when I've told them that I've had to explain to my classes what a typewriter is and how it works. We didn't have a television set in the bureau. We got our news from the 2 wire services, the Associated Press and the United Press International. And that came over teletype machines, which are sort of like big typewriters. And they made imprints on paper, and then the paper would come through and you just rip the paper off and take it to wherever you needed it. They were noisy, they clattered, and we kept them in soundproof boxes in the front office of our bureau. That was also occupied by a news aide, or what in those days we called a copy boy, who was also a college student. Usually when there was big news, the machines would go ding, 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 indicating an urgent or a bulletin. About 1 p.m., sitting an office away, we hear this thump, thump, clang, clang, and we shouted out to the copy boy in the next office, "Phil, what's going on?" "Kennedy's been shot." And we said, "Stop joking around." We went running into the front room, but the words on the bulletin were no joke. "Kennedy shot seriously, perhaps fatally." Not all that long after, less than an hour, came the first flash I'd ever seen in my few years in the news business. The assistant White House press secretary officially announcing the death of the president at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. The flash simply read, "Kennedy dead, dash, 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 official." Here's how Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted TV news anchor, delivered that news to millions of Americans. This veteran journalist who had covered wars, interviewed presidents and world leaders, struggling to maintain his composure. Oops, what happened to it? Oh, hold it, there we go. My classes always know what trouble I have. Here we go.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
And there I was, barely 21 years old, stunned like every other citizen of the U.S. and the world. But unlike most of my fellow citizens, I knew I had to go to work. That at this age, so early in my career, I was covering the biggest story of my life. And of course, there is no journalism school. There were no sage and wise old reporters who could tell you what to do when a president is assassinated, riding in the streets of a major American city in an open car, his wife next to him, and bullets strike and mortally wound him. There were reporters around who remembered the death of President Franklin Roosevelt nearly 20 years before, but he was an older man who died a natural death. The last assassination, and there have been 3 in our history, was at the turn of the century. All you could do at a time like that is let your instincts kick in. Our bureau was set up to provide Washington news to papers around the country about their congressmen and senators and other stories about Washington of regional interest. I remember calling up Massachusetts congressional offices to get statements from the congressmen, talking to secretaries in various degrees of emotional distress, taking down the statements, other reaction comments, and putting them together for a story for the Boston Herald in Kennedy's hometown. One of my other jobs on a normal Friday was to call movie theaters for another paper we represented, the show business paper Variety. That was a big thing for that paper. They called them movie grosses, what movies were pulling in the crowds and making money. But I knew that Friday afternoon that no one in Washington would be going to the movies that weekend. So I put that off to the side. We left our office around 10 o'clock that night. It was still balmy. I drove to the apartment of a family friend where my mother had taken refuge. And that was where I got the first sense of what the American television networks were doing. The assassination was a transforming moment in American political history. It was also a transforming time in American and international journalism. From the time the first shots were fired, and for 4 straight days, the 3 U.S. television networks, and there were only 3 then, no cable TV, stopped all regular programming, canceled all advertising, and did non-stop coverage from that Friday afternoon through Monday, the day of the funeral. Americans, of course, as Scott has mentioned, bought and read and collected newspapers that weekend. But the country was transfixed to its television sets. The networks had never done anything like it. Now, of course, when there's a big event, it goes on the networks and cable TV. But at that point, covering a live event for 4 days, and they did it well. In contrast to much of what we see today, they let the pictures and natural sounds, and often even only the silence, tell the story. There was a minimum of the kind of commentary and yakking that drives so many of us crazy now. For example, at the funeral of Princess Diana, when I thought these people would never shut up. In those 4 days, television surpassed print as the major conveyor of news, especially in the United States, but also around the world, because coincidentally, a year before, the first global communications satellite called Telstar had been launched, and it was now possible instantaneously to send pictures and sound to many countries around the world. So it was not just Americans who were able to watch what transpired in the following days. Days in which the weather seemed to be a metaphor from above. The Saturday, as the president's coffin lay in state in the East Room of the White House, dignitaries came to pay their respects, former presidents, Eisenhower and Truman, and other officials. It was a deluge of non-stop rain. The next 2 days of the public funeral, it turned bitterly cold. On the Sunday, we stood on Pennsylvania Avenue, that broad ceremonial boulevard that connects the White House and the Capitol, as a horse-drawn caisson bore the president's coffin to ceremonies at the Capitol. 300,000 people were on the pavements, but there was only silence, until off in the distance we heard the tap, tap, tap of the drum corps leading the simple procession. In the cars behind, the new president, along with Mrs. Kennedy and her 2 young children. But in the crowds, there were many people with small transistor radios. They sort of kept them up against their ear, listening to radio broadcasts. And the news came that the president's accused assassin, this strange character named Lee Harvey Oswald, an American who had just returned from the Soviet Union with a Russian wife, and the Soviet Union, of course, in those days was the arch Cold War enemy of the United States, and who had been last seen in public handing out pamphlets for Cuba's Fidel Castro. Oswald had been shot and soon after would die himself. As if there was not enough emotion already, sorrow, profound sadness, deep grief, now sheer anger. Have the yahoos totally taken over the country? An assassination in Dallas, a city which had been associated with extreme right-wing views and groups, and now this hick police force parading the accused assassin in front of live TV cameras and allowing him to be shot by the owner of a strip club who had connections to the mob. And it was just a reminder, as incredible as it seems now, that in 1963 there was no federal or U.S. law covering the murder of a U.S. president. The only law enforcement was local. It's hardly a surprise that an entire industry of conspiracy theorists has developed around the Kennedy assassination, just as one did around Lincoln's murder a century before. The Monday of the funeral, the greatest gathering of world leaders since the funeral of King Edward VII of England in 1910, de Gaulle of France towering over Haile Selassie of Ethiopia and King Baudouin of the Belgians, Prince Philip, and the presidents of premiers from all over the world. One exception was China. The 2 countries had no diplomatic relations at the time, and over that weekend, some state propaganda organs were denouncing rather than mourning Kennedy. They all walked from the White House up Connecticut Avenue to the Catholic Cathedral in Midtown Washington, a nationally televised ceremony, probably the first time millions of Americans had ever witnessed a Roman Catholic service for the nation's first and still only Catholic president. They walked behind Mrs. Kennedy and the president's 2 brothers, a scene so indelibly printed in the minds of 180 million Americans alive at that time. And as a British reporter wrote that day, she gave America what it had always lacked before, a sense of majesty. The children followed in a car behind, looking out the window, undoubtedly mystified, Caroline at age 6, and John, who was observing his 3rd birthday that very day, about what was going on. And of course, after the funeral, John Jr. saluting the coffin of his father, as the pool TV cameraman, struggling to hold his own emotions, trying to keep the camera steady, zoom in for the shot that is now part of the history of humanity. Bands played dirges, the full panoply of the state was on display, but curiously 2 things have stuck in my mind all these years. One was a band playing Onward Christian Soldiers, a rousing hymn, but one no longer sung in most Protestant churches because it is considered too warlike. And behind that band, a contingent of cadets from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. I have often wondered how many of them survived the Vietnam War, but because it was those classes of cadets who later became young platoon and company commanders who proportionally took the heaviest American casualties of that war. America and the world could mourn, so presumably could we as reporters and journalists. But unlike them, we had to put our emotions on hold. we had to work. Those 4 days, we had to produce. We had to provide the news that so riveted our readers. And it was a swirl of emotions. At one point, I remember watching on TV as Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then a young Kennedy aide who would later become a U.S. Senator, talking in front of the White House, and he had this Irish gift for memorable phrasing. He said 2 things that have remained with me all these years. There is no sense of being Irish unless you understand that someday the world is going to break your heart. We all think we're going to have more time, and so did he. To which Moynihan added and discussed a colloquy that he had had with another Kennedy aide who had said, "We will never laugh again." And Moynihan replied, "We will laugh again, but we will never be young again." And I thought, how right on the mark, how profound. But I'm only 21 years old. And I realized, as I had never before, of how many generations before mine had seen their youth vanish. Those who lost their dearest in the ghastly trenches of World War I, those whose youth vanished in the Great Depression and World War II. We, the American and international youth of the early 60s, were merely part of a historical procession. But in subsequent years, to bring this a little bit closer to home, we've now seen 2 generations of Chinese youth whose youth has been crushed in the Cultural Revolution and at Tiananmen Square. Alas, the historical procession keeps going on. And how do journalists cope at such times? How do we prevent ourselves the tendency, you're covering a major story you know is going to change the world. How do you keep from feeling overwhelmed? We just had to keep on writing. One piece I remember, and it was not necessarily all that memorable or brilliant, was one I wrote for Variety about how the Kennedys had brought new buzz, new flair to Washington. What these days we would call buzz. A feeling that this sleepy southern town was finally coming into its own as a real city with real culture. A judgment perhaps premature then, but it seemed real at the time. I have often thought, as I did a memoir on the assassination 10 years ago for our production company, and in recent times, do journalists become emotionally detached over time, covering grim stories but at some remove, or do emotionally detached people wander into journalism? Perhaps a better question for a battery of psychiatrists, but one that is always there. As I've been talking with you all, at times like that, you really just have to let your instincts take over. Remember what you were there to do. For all those 4 days, no tears came. As attached as I was to the Kennedys, their glamour, humor, dash, and flair, my fundamental agreement with what the President and his administration were trying to accomplish at home and abroad. Reporters are supposed to be, but rarely can be, politically neutral. And the excitement of all the news of those years. Some really dangerous moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the construction of the Berlin Wall. The drama of Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner speech at the Wall. The Civil Rights Movement. The Arms Control Treaty with the Soviets. It was an exciting time to be a reporter, especially a young reporter. As Wordsworth wrote in the early days of the French Revolution, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. The tears only came decades later, when I was reading a wonderful biography of Jackie Kennedy by the British author Sarah Bradford. It was a lovely summer morning, and I was sitting on the deck of a friend's house on the Chesapeake Bay, got to the chapter about the assassination and funeral, and suddenly I started crying. That is a delayed reaction. Of course, there is the very valid argument that the entire Washington press was seduced by the Kennedys and played a major role in mythologizing them after the assassination. Certainly, JFK played the press, and he had a number of particular friends in the press, like a fiddle, in the way that no subsequent president has even tried to do. There was no reporting on the philandering and other character flaws. The rules of the game were very different then. 2 decades before cable TV, 3 decades before the internet. Most of the news consumed by most Americans was decided by editors at a half a dozen or so news organizations in New York and Washington. As you know, Kennedy is remembered for some special speeches. For example, the inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Less remarked upon was his ability and that of his speechwriters to invoke biblical Old Testament phrases into his speeches to bolster a point. And such was the case in the speech prepared for delivery at the Dallas Trade Mart, where the motorcade was headed that fateful afternoon. A speech to be delivered to a presumably conservative audience focused on national defense and security. You get an idea from the last paragraph how he could rally people, stir them with the quality of his rhetoric, even if some of those words now ring a bit hollow for those of us who went through the Vietnam War and subsequent American disasters overseas. As was written, we in this country, in this generation, are by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That always must be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain. These last lines from the Psalms, Psalm 127. And those were the words that poured into my head 38 years later, now as the senior producer of a major national TV news program, as I watched the Twin Towers crumble on 9/11. The only story in all those years, even amidst such major stories as Vietnam, the turmoil of 1968, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, that did not seem something of an anticlimax after November 22nd, 1963. As I remarked at my farewell from the NewsHour broadcast a couple of years ago, those lines of verse speak to a life and a career in journalism bookended by 2 national and international traumas, the Kennedy assassination and 9/11. 1988 marked the 25th anniversary of the assassination and was accompanied by a new generation of historians who felt that they had to write or check the balance of the first generation of history, which they had felt too laudatory and mythologizing of Kennedy and his record, a term referred to as historical revisionism. This time around, the next generation of historians seem to be taking a more favorable, though still mixed view of Kennedy's record, listing him among the good, but not necessarily the great presidents, his good deeds outdoing his mistakes. Generally, to the ranks of what they call the great presidents, Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, among them, have to serve at least 8 years in the White House, a full term. Kennedy, of course, only served 3, and that was part of the elusiveness of his record and also an elusive personality which no one ever seemed capable of totally grasping. He was cool, he was detached. Again, unusual characteristics in a politician. But he was not the member of his family who expected to be the politician. That was the older brother, Joseph Kennedy, who was killed during World War II, and then Jack had to assume the role of the inheritor. But his disposition was always more of that of a writer, journalist, and he had that detached personality. So it's always been hard for historians to figure out what kind of person he was, what drove him. Other presidents, Johnson and Nixon, their personalities are really out there, and it's a lot easier to make a judgment about them. Alan Brinkley, the son of David Brinkley, the famous NBC anchorman, was one of those who puts Kennedy in the ranks of the good but not the greatest president, and commented, though, that even all these years later, how different it seems that there's this aspect about him that draws a form of idolatry that does not surround other presidents. Again, maybe it was because of the shortness of the term, the meteor-like quality of him and his presidency. And I got one example of this. A friend of mine from Korea was in the United States, and he's only 30 years old, so he was born 20 years after the assassination. And there was an exhibition at the museum in Washington of Kennedy. There were 2 films about Kennedy and other material there, and he came away very moved by that. And I still can't quite figure it out, because a lot of us had assumed that by the time my generation departs the scene in the next few decades, that a lot of this Kennedy mystery will go away. But it does seem to be being carried by subsequent generations, and largely because of this elusive quality about him. Back at the time that this revisionism was going on, I wrote a note to one of my oldest friends on the occasion of her daughter's wedding. We had grown up together as political junkies, and perhaps only in Washington would kids skip school to go down to the Capitol and watch the Senate. As I wrote to her then, if we have any regrets, and let us hope they are few, it is that we have not been able to pass along to the next generation the optimism and hope that we felt at that age, the faith we had in our country, the world, and in our futures, in ourselves. This was not Camelot. This was our reality, and we lived it to the fullest. The writers will write, the revisionists will revise, but what we had was special, and that no one can take away from us. Thank you. Question? All my shy students? Nobody has a question? Yeah.
Hi, Michael. I read that there are lots of compelling theories, including conspiracy, a lot of conspiracies surrounding the death of Kennedy, or even in the time before. But you somehow can't just left a piece of history in blank. So, what is some theory that a majority of Americans today buy regarding his death?
Well, I don't know if a majority of Americans believe any particular theory. I think a lot of Americans, maybe it's a majority, I haven't seen the most recent polls, distrust the official account. Right after the assassination, President Johnson appointed the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, and appointed a commission along with Warren to investigate the assassination, because there was not going to be a trial anymore. Oswald was not going to be put on trial, even in a local court, for a murder where presumably evidence could be brought, he could be questioned, so on and so forth. Did he have any help? Whatever. Since that wasn't going to happen, they appointed this commission, but it's very distinguished people. And I can't remember whether the FBI director was on it, but the CIA director was on it. And so there was some aspect of having the fox be in charge of the chicken coop there. But nevertheless, this commission came out in September of '64 and basically gave the official story that it was Oswald firing from the Texas School Book Depository, shots from behind, etc., etc. There was no gunman on the grassy knoll opposite the boulevard where Kennedy was riding. There were no other people involved. Oswald wasn't getting his orders from anybody else. And as I mentioned, this industry sort of started people questioning one thing and the other. Now, I just saw on the NewsHour website a clip from my former boss, Jim Lehrer. Actually, there's a story there. The NewsHour is in a way a creation of the Kennedy assassination. McNeil was with NBC covering the White House, riding the White House press bus. Lehrer was working for the Dallas Times-Herald and was at the airport where Kennedy landed. And they got to know each other. I think they met each other during the trial of Jack Ruby, the guy who killed Oswald. And they formed this professional relationship since. Lehrer said, and I was a little surprised, I saw him on this clip, saying he's inclined to believe the official story, but even he would not be surprised if somebody came up and made some deathbed confession. Yeah, they did this, this, and that, and they had some role in it. I mean, we just don't know. There's any number of reasons to be skeptical. You know, where the bullets were, and this, and that, and the other thing. And the fact that Oswald was killed. And the reason I mentioned the mob was because President Kennedy, even more so his brother, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, were very actively going after Castro, particularly after the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which the United States supported a bunch of Cuban exiles, and the whole thing was a disaster. And Castro triumphed over the Yankee imperialists. And after that, they were going for him. There's no question about it. And I think these are pretty well substantiated. I never really followed this all that much, but that the anti-Castro forces included a lot of mobsters. Because in the old days, Castro's predecessor, the mob controlled all the gambling down there and made a lot of money. And they didn't like Castro either. And so was there a connection between the mob, Ruby, whatever? I mean, I think it's fairly clear that Robert Kennedy, to some extent, blamed himself, wondering if that he might have provoked some Castro reaction that led to the killing of Kennedy. But all we have is theories. We have nothing more than theories until and unless, as Lehrer said, somebody comes up from their deathbed and said, yeah, I did it, or I organized it, or something like that. But that's going to have to happen fairly soon, because whoever this person was would be getting close to 100 years old. So. Yeah.
Not very related to the Kennedy assassination, but I'm just wondering about the emotional attachment that you mentioned. So, based on your various experience, can you provide any examples where you found yourself, okay, how can I balance between those two, emotional attachment, emotional detachment under a certain topic? How can you overcome that kind of challenge? Can you share any experiences?
Well, I guess you just have to do it through your professional training and professionalism. It really is sort of a matter of putting your emotions on hold. The reason, and I've talked to you all in class about this, the whole concept of, quote, objective American journalism, which is not really followed anywhere else in the world, is because in some ways it's an impossibility that everybody is a creature of their own upbringing, their own background, their own education. So everybody's going to look at a story differently. And they're going to be bringing these inner things to the story, even if they try and write the story as straight as they can. I mean, I guess the classic example is if you're covering a political campaign, and you may like one candidate better than the other candidate, you still have a professional obligation and an obligation to your readers and your viewers to be as straight as you can and not let your political biases seep into your coverage. But on the really big things, like something as big as the assassination or 9/11, I think you just really have to click in to the next level of sensory perception or whatever you want to call it. And it's almost like going into overdrive or something on a car. That you say, there's a story out here, and and I'm part of the team or I'm part of the group that's covering this story. And we just have to do the job. And that's first and primary. And I think most journalists sort of have that instinct in them anyway, or they wouldn't be going into the business. And it just kicks in, as I said, kicks into overdrive the bigger the story, and then somewhere along the line, you have to give vent to your emotions. You just can't do it right at that very moment. I hope that answers your question.
So you always view emotional attachment as negative one?
No, not necessarily. They just, they're a reality. Your emotional reactions are a reality. But I think it's more a matter, you just have to sort of, as I said, put them on hold. If you're out covering a big story, I mean, it's pretty hard to report and write while you're emotionally venting. You can do one or the other. But if you're doing journalism, maybe you can emotionally vent, I guess, when you're writing a novel. But when you're writing journalism, you really do, I guess, just have to separate yourself from it. It's a temporary thing. You're not talking about doing it forever. You're talking about getting through that very day. Just that day that this disastrous mega event happens. And it happens at 9 o'clock or 1 o'clock or whatever. You know you just got to get through that day. And you've got to do your job. And deliver whatever the product you're delivering, TV report or newspaper story or whatever. And then at some point after that, you can unwind your emotions.
I have two questions. First one, after the assassination, maybe there will be a lot of anniversaries every year on November 22nd. And so how do you cover those stories on the anniversary and maybe makes it something new, like find out some spots, something new on the annual anniversary?
Well, of course, there was there were a number of, I mean, the first 5 years, they were pretty heavy anniversary coverage. And there were services around, like St. Matthew's, where the funeral was held, and various members of the family would go to the grave site at Arlington. You've seen the pictures of the eternal flame. And you just do stories about what was happening. In the 5th, 10th, 25th, there's a lot of coverage on the 25th anniversary, some on the 40th, now the 50th, and I think there's going to be a huge drop-off after that. I mean, on the big anniversaries, you see people trying to do commentary. I had thought that being away from home was going to be worse than it actually is proven to be. In some ways, it's almost a blessing, because from everything I hear from my friends, the problem with modern television, and particularly the cable networks, is they've now come up with the mantra of a bad cook, that nothing is done until it's overdone. And it's just so much on CNN and these other things. I mean, they just loop and loop and loop and loop. And, you know, I'm just glad I'm away from it. I can sit here, go on websites, click on one or two articles. Jill Abramson in the New York Times had a wonderful review of some of the major Kennedy books, and she, like a lot of other people, was having trouble grasping at this elusive character and his hold on the American imagination. You can pick and choose. But as I said, it's commentary. Commentary on Kennedy's presidency. What did it accomplish? What did it accomplish negatively? There's always speculation on what would have happened in the second term should he have been reelected. That's pure speculation. All you can do is guess. You have no way of knowing. Although I think you can say pretty securely that the civil rights law that was passed in the summer of 1964, the really big breakthrough, would not have been passed in the strong form it was passed had Kennedy remained president. Because two things happened. First of all, it was log jammed in Congress while he was president. He gets killed. Johnson uses the emotional thrust of the assassination. And secondly, we haven't talked much about Johnson, but there's never been a president of the United States who had a better command of the legislative process, who knew how Congress worked. He was a creature of Congress. He had been Senate Majority Leader before he became Vice President. He knew all these guys really deeply and personally. He knew their vulnerabilities. He knew their strengths. And nobody worked Congress and the Senate better than he did. And that's how that civil rights law got through. So I think you can say with some assurance that Johnson's becoming president was a direct result, the civil rights bill was a direct result of him becoming president. The rest is speculation. I think it's going to be interesting. I'll be gone, but to see how the Kennedy record lasts as you go further in your careers and into your lives. I mean, how much of the mystery, the magic, and everything is going to be around in 10 years or 20 years, particularly after the generation that was closest to him is no longer around.
The second one. As Kennedy is from a very famous family, so maybe the class will focus more on his daughter. His daughter Caroline is also a U.S. ambassador.
She just became one, yeah.
Yeah. And so will the news agency just pay more attention on his children or family members just because he was assassinated president? And so will they cover the stories of his family differently from others?
They attract some attention. She's pretty good at staying out of the public eye when she doesn't want to be in the public. She learned that from her mother. Her mother was the most famous woman in the world and never gave an interview. Anybody else would be on Oprah every other week. As I said, people have forgotten how you build mystique these days. They think you build it going on Oprah every week, which is exactly the wrong conclusion. But so Caroline will do her job as ambassador, and she's there at a tough time. I mean, the Japanese and the Koreans are at each other's throats, and it's a difficult time, so she's really going to be tested. Even though she's got a skilled diplomatic staff beneath her, if things start getting screwed up, she's going to get blamed. John, of course, is dead, and his death, I mean, he died, you know, he flew his own airplane, and the plane disappeared into the ocean. And that provoked 2 days long coverage. He was nothing more than the son of a president, but he was the little kid in the picture. And it really got to people. Plus, he was, you know, drop dead handsome. I mean, he was the idol of every woman and a lot of men around the world. So, I mean, he's a very glamorous figure. The other kids, dynasties in the United States, I mean, none of Roosevelt's kids really turned out to be all that much. Bush has had a dynasty, and the less said about that, the better. You know, I don't think there's going to be undue. I mean, yeah, one of them gets elected to Congress or something, they get a certain amount of attention, but it's not really that big. Okay.
Thank you for your speech. I'm really touched by your speech. So my question is, even though you are in Hong Kong, far away from your home in the United States, but there are some journalists of your time and age. What are their doings, or will they organize some memorable to commemorate this assassination of Kennedy?
You mean in the States? No, maybe I didn't hear your question properly.
Okay. Even though you're in Hong Kong, you're not back in the United States, but there are some journalists of your time and age. Are they going to organize some activities to commemorate this assassination, or?
No, I don't think there will be any one particular event. I think various journalists in the United States, the ones who are there, they'll be on various CNN and other programs talking about it. Jim and Robin, my two former bosses who both played a role in the coverage, have appeared on what used to be their program. I will tell you one interesting story about McNeil. He was on the bus. The way they organize these motorcades, actually there are a couple of interesting press stories that you as journalists would appreciate. The way they organize these motorcades, you know, you have the president, and the person in the car with him was Governor Conley of Texas and Governor Conley's wife. And Conley was shot seriously in that thing, but he survived. And then you have other cars, and then there's what they call a pool car, which is a couple of reporters riding in a car, and then the rest of the press is in a bus or a couple of buses. Now those bulletins that I referred you to were from Merriman Smith, a famous White House correspondent who was in the pool car. But in those days the pool car had only one car phone. I mean, we didn't have cell phones or anything like that. Car phones, that was a big deal. And there was this big bulky car phone. The first shot's fired, and Smith is sharing the car with Jack Bell of the Associated Press. The first shots are fired, Smith grabs the phone and is connected to the Dallas Bureau of UPI. And he starts dictating. I think his first bulletin was shots fired at Kennedy's car.